Hello and welcome to a new series of Material Matters with Grant Gibson. The show has been running for 6 years now, would you believe? However, for listeners who might be new to all this, the idea is that I speak to a designer, maker, artist or architect about a material or technique with which they're intrinsically linked and discover how it changed their lives and careers. Today, I'm delighted to be talking to one of the most intriguing and uncompromising ceramic artists currently practicing in the UK. Neil Brownsword's work is inspired by the de-industrialisation of his home city, Stoke-on-Trent. His career in ceramics began when he worked as an apprentice in the Wedgwood factory in the mid-80s. Subsequently, he went on to study at the University of Cardiff and the Royal College of Art. Neil's research examines the manufacturing histories of North Staffordshire's ceramic industry and the effects globalisation has had upon people, place and traditional skills in recent decades. He's won numerous awards and exhibited across the globe, while at the same time maintaining an important career in education. He's currently a professor of ceramics at the University of Staffordshire. As the critic David Whiting has written, Neil has intelligently and sensitively evolved a language of considerable poetry, one that has much to say about the transformative fabric of clay and its potency as a register of human experience and historical change. Neil, hello, how are you?
Really good. How are you doing?
Good, I'm all right. Yeah. First podcast of the year. I'm a bit rusty and quite excited all at the same time. Was that reasonably accurate?
Yeah. Gosh, sounds very flamboyant.
I mean, we often seem to meet in January. I remember the first time I interviewed you, it was back in 2008. And it was like, I don't know, January the 3rd. Your Christmas tree was still up and the kids were playing with their new presents. I'm guessing they're quite old now, your children.
Yeah. Well, one of them's left home, the other's at university, and we still have two here, So
very good. Very
time
good.
Goes quick.
It does seem to. And how old are the two that are left with you?
12 and 21.
Oh, wow.
I think then.
Yeah, you did. I was testing you then. So look, we have a bit of a tradition on this podcast of asking guests to describe where they are, to give our listeners a little bit of context. I mean, I'm looking at you on a screen. Yeah, you're not giving much away. Where are you right now?
I'm actually in the front living room of the house, which is, I guess you could say it's part of an extended studio. Last time it was in the middle room of the house.
Yeah.
But, the problem is I'm quite productive with work and I have a few places to store the stuff, so it is everywhere. So I'm a very tolerant wife.
Obviously. I mean, let's talk about your studio, which is sort of in the house, is it? Or where is it?
Well, I had a garage built a couple of years back, so I kind of work from there. I also rent a place, which is just down the road at the Spode factory, but that is actually kind of full as well.
Okay.
So I work in between home and there.
So are you a tidy worker, or what does your workspace look like?
It's chaos most of the time, and unless it's chaos, then things don't function. When I tidy up, I can't find anything. That's the problem.
Okay. All right.
But I think it's one of these things. I've just got to see things in the space. I can't put things away and then work independent. Everything's got to be out everywhere. So I've got it's kind of. Yeah, it is a chaotic mess in this front room. Glad you can only see the back of me and not what's behind.
And on right now, and until the 8th of February, you have a show on at the Craft Study Centre in Farnham, in Surrey, called Obsolescence and Renewal. I was there over the weekend, and it's like a bit of a multicultural. It's a bit of a multimedia even experience. The first thing visitors see is a film of kaolin being made. There are historical artifacts from Stoke-on-Trent, remnants of the industrial processes like your salvage series, which we'll probably go on to talk a little bit about. There are textiles on the wall. And then there are these 3D printed objects that look a bit like, well, bits of pots on scaffolding. So What's going on there, Neil? Talk me through it.
Yeah, well, I've always looked at ceramics as an expanded practice, and I think what intrigues me the most is looking at, I guess, the structure and idea of what ceramics is through the lens of other media. I love working with clay as a material, and it's very much, embedded in my history and family history. But I've just started to, whether it's performative and it's done by proxy, explore ceramics as a broader subject rather than the stuff in itself. I was quite interested. Well, the history of ceramics is, you can go back through time, and it has this skeuomorphic, property. Earliest pots were made or lined basketware and then fired. So clay is this wonderful material which can take on the form of another material. So I've always been fascinated about that transference of ideas in between different materials. And again, if you look back at the 18th century, just silverware and ceramics, how it influenced each other. So I think I've never been a purist about the material, and I think that me being able to work across media and materials is what keeps me interested.
But how do those ideas manifest themselves in Surrey? What are people looking at as they walk into that room?
Yeah, I mean, it was quite an interesting context, Craft Study Centre, because Stephen, it was an exhibition which was here in 2023 at the Brampton Museum, and Stephen Knott came to visit.
Who's the chief exec or the head of the Craft Study Centre?
Craft Study Centre. Yeah. He's recently in post, and he was kind of wanting to take something which was, I hate the expression, oven ready to take to Craft Study Centre.
Kiln fired, it should be.
Kiln fired. So I agreed. But I think what was interesting for me was that context and history of studio ceramics. And, the dichotomy between studio and industry has always been a bone of contention for me. So to situate this body of work, which basically draws upon origins of industry into that place of of a history of studio, was quite an interesting jar. It was something, to get a conversation going again. Because, you look at that collection, it is predominantly studio ceramics. What I've done with this exhibition has gone back, I guess, to that transition point between, craft and industry, where kind of early 1720s, you have what you can say is collective labour, you have a kind of marketplace, and, skill starts to be segregated. And, as early as 1715, 1720 in North Staffordshire, most people think the Industrial Revolution is much later, but it's happening here, at that period. So I start to look at these kind of proto or pre kind of industrial ceramics because, there's a burgeoning market for tea drinking.
Yeah.
Regional potters are hoping to plug demand. And there's a spur of innovation during that period. Things are not kind of so manufactured to death, let's say. There is that kind of evidence of touch and the hand, and these objects have just been a constant point of fascination for me.
So how does that fit in with those fairly extraordinary looking, I have to say, 3D printed objects on the wall that you see?
Yeah, well, they are actual remnants from early production. So They are from a factory which is just down the road here in Newcastle-under-Lyme. It's a Samuel Bell factory, which no one really knows about. And this is part of, I guess, the kind of underpinning of the exhibition is these marginalised histories of production. People have forgotten about them. They're so key to the identity of place, but I guess they're in danger of getting lost, these stories. So me using my artistic practice to, I guess, resurrect them and kind of make them prominent, or put them back into people's kind of conversation again, was part of the exhibition. I've always been fascinated by the presence of absence in the work, so the fragment is kind of key. It's always been key, fragmentation. And there's this fabulous collection of semi-formed pieces which the Brampton Museum has in its reserve collection, which go back to 1720, 1730, early redware, agate production. But it just seems to, it speaks of this transition, this demand. These things are partly thrown and turned, some evidence of early moulding, to create standardization in production. And also what they speak of as cultural influence, because they start to, in their fabric, introduce kind of images of, let's say, the exotic through kind of exchange with China, Chinese objects, images. So that all those things are a point of fascination for me. One, this place just trying to survive and make a living, and the idea of copying everyone else was prevalent around here.
Yes.
You only got to think about, I guess, the willow pattern. Every factory made it in Stoke-on-Trent. It was something, staple survival. And one idea. This is the problem with attribution with different factories, because it's difficult to attribute something, let's say, from that period, because everyone was copying each other.
Yeah.
And it was it's really hard to, I guess, say for definite. Archaeology has proven some things, but not everything.
So the 3D printed fragments, then, that's your notion of preservation, or? So
they were, I mean, they were 3D scanned, the archaeology there, and I was, like I said, interested in this idea of the copy. And through the process of 3D scanning, just simple observations of, you scan one side of the object and you scan the other side, and then there's this transition where the two halves of the objects join. And I thought, wow, that's kind of pretty, it's all on a screen, of course. I was kind of really taken by that kind of clash of things merging together to become one. And it made me take the data from some of these scans and start to kind of play around with, merging the two together. That's why you'll see kind of one form integrated with another form. And, it's always been quite important for me to bear evidence of making within whatever I'm working with, whether it's clay or another material. So the scaffolding, which you mentioned, as part of the process of the 3D printing. And I was always interested in 3D printing because there's been, mixed opinions about, it's kind of cheap, or it's trashy, or it's kind of less value. But that's what intrigued me. It's about those kind of value judgments, what people assign to a 3D print, as well as containing something of history and technology, the two together as one thing. So that's why for that exhibition I didn't decide to turn them back into clay. It was quite, interesting for me to keep them as the raw 3D printed material.
Yeah.
I mean, in the past I have done, this idea of replicating something which is discarded, 3D scanning it, making a mould of it, but going back to the historic recipes from those objects, remixing the recipes, and then casting them back in the mould to induce more failure. So that's what's interesting for me.
There's something very architectural about them. I guess it's the scaffolding. I mean, pots and architecture do have a relationship. It's all about volume, isn't it, I suppose? But yeah, they're quite interesting objects.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people have said that about the architecture. I'd love to see something like that scaled up. It'd be great to see something, of scale with that intricacy. And, the glitch, the error in reproduction is quite interesting for me, because technology can do everything these days, can't it? To perfection. And I haven't got a technological bone in my body. You know, I'm okay with a bit of clay, but you know, in terms of just dealing with the kind of setup for the microphone, it's a major trauma for me.
We got there though. We got there with the microphone. Yeah.
But so I'm kind of lo-fi, and I love that idea of taking something of the high tech and just abusing it or taking it apart. And I downloaded this free program off the web, Blender, and we'd worked. We took no end of scans, and I could guarantee I'd mess them up within, just by pushing a few buttons, push and pulls of some of these kind of buttons on the Blender program, which kind of did something interesting. It was that immediacy and unpredictability, and just kind of like, say, clashing two scans together and seeing what happened, or turning something inside out. So it had got an immediacy of like a sketchbook for me, working with the digital, and then to get them printed at the other end, which was often hit and miss because the scans were that messed up at the end. It was difficult to print. You'd kind of fill a lot of the holes in the mesh. But it really got me kind of curious about working with the digital as a tool, and I've always been. There's always been something about the digital. When I started work as an apprentice at Wedgwood in 1987, CAM had just been introduced into the modelling department. So my training, which was all analogue, began with the introduction of the CAD-CAM on the factory, which was still in its really basic, crude form. And practically at the other end, you'd got to hand model it anyway when it came out of the machine. But obviously through 30 years plus, technology has advanced significantly since then, and since replaced those jobs which I trained as a modeler on the Wedgwood factory. So, but there's this reliance on technology. Like I said, people think it's the be all and end all. But I just see it as another tool in the toolkit, which may sound a bit of a cliche, but I'm just intrigued with the parameters of what it gives to help me move forward with the work.
Interesting. I mean, I'm going to take a slightly different tack, because you mentioned your family history with the ceramics industry earlier. And I'll be honest, usually when I'm doing these interviews, I wait a while before going into the guest's backstory. But you and generations of your family are so intimately connected to Stoke-on-Trent and the ceramics industry. I mean, your history is kind of almost indivisible from your work. So can we talk about your relationship with Stoke? I mean, you were born there. What was it like then?
I was born in neighbouring Newcastle-under-Lyme, actually, but I've lived in Stoke longer now than back home with Mum and Dad.
Faulty research.
I mean, as growing up as a kid, you were kind of surrounded by a landscape of hills and holes. It was kind of, extraction from brick manufacture at the back of my mum and dad's house, and these kind of sites of excavation which are known as marl holes. A Truria marl is a seam of clay which runs from North Staffordshire to South Staffordshire, about 28 miles, this seam of clay is. And the house where Mum and Dad are is on this seam of clay. So, I can remember very early on as a kid accessing this red sticky stuff at the back of the house, and kind of it's everywhere. You kick the grass over and it's there. There's no topsoil; it's just the clay and the grass. So you're physically surrounded by that materiality, but also the landscape. Like I said, it's a kind of landscape of industry, of factories, former factories. So yeah, you're surrounded by it, and then family. My grandmother had worked in the industry. She worked in it all her working life. In the days of, I guess, when work was prevalent, you could work at one factory. If you didn't like it, finish at the end of the week and start another factory. It was that kind of thing.
Mm.
And
what does she do now in the industry?
She did a range of skilled and semi-skilled jobs, from her hand painting, lithographing, selecting. So I guess she was multi-skilled. But what was interesting for me growing up was with each factory she worked in, she would collect ceramics from the factory and have a typical kind of 1930s, 40s china cabinet with all this stuff in. And it was usually kind of novelty wear. But as a kid, you kind of intrigued by this stuff, let's say. But, the fact that it's in a cabinet and locked away, you can't kind of physically access it. So I guess growing up with that material culture and knowledge of, what people did as work, it's kind of embedded within you, isn't it?
Well, I remember seeing a photo. Was it your grandfather with one of the Wedgwood clan?
Yeah, well, the family, this is like recent kind of research. The family, I've traced the family tree back, and there is a Brownsword who's working at Wedgwood, 1796, Etruria. And then his children are also working at Wedgwood. And there's 3 brothers there who are working on the factory. My direct descendant is a oven man, so he's kind of managing the kilns. But the other 2 brothers are quite interesting because, this, again, finding out stuff recently, kind of digging into that past and, census surveys and stuff. People just stay here. They kind of stayed where the work was, and families, generations of potters going. There's actually, Hamlet Brownsword, who was another descendant, who works at Minton's. Some fabulous names: Absalom Brownsword and Aaron Brownsword, all very Moses Brownsword, all very
Moses
biblical.
Brownsword. Excellent.
So. Digging into that history has been really. I'm sure there's a project here. There's a piece of work here just to work with that history.
And did your parents work in ceramics?
No, they didn't. I think they escaped. My dad worked as an electrical engineer, and my mum worked at a local school.
Okay.
But they didn't work in the industry. But I was fortunate at school. I went to a school which doesn't exist now, Bradwell High School. Fortunate to have 2 very encouraging art teachers who obviously recognised something. And I used to go and avoid doing PE and do ceramics instead. It was my get out of PE, so I'd spend time in the pottery class doing stuff there, making things. And then I did an O-level early, and then an A-level early, then an O-level in ceramics early.
But you did them very early. I mean, you were like
O-level.
13 or something ridiculous when you took A-level art.
I think, yeah, 13, 14 for O-level.
Yeah, proper prodigy.
Right? A-level at 15.
Yeah.
And then O-level ceramics at 16. Yeah, so. But then I'd kind of destined to work. My brother had studied fine art at Staff's Poly. And I think me mum and dad didn't want another bloody artist, So they were very kind of determined to get me doing something else. They weren't that kind of pressured about it, but
hence becoming a model maker at 16, apprentice model maker at the Wedgwood factory.
I'd applied for a job as an accountant, but thank God I didn't get it. But by luck, there was a government, local government inspector who came to the school, and she saw some of the ceramics I'd made in the final year at school, and she got a connection at Wedgwood. And they just fixed up an interview. I'd left school, I think it was in the June or July, early July. And then I had an interview at Wedgwood. So I was interviewed by a kind of ceramic design hero, Robert Minkin.
Okay.
I can remember it quite vividly. And another guy who was head of modelers called Mike Dillon. And, well, one from design and one from the modelers. And Mike said, I'll take him. So I was kind of chucked in the deep end with a group of, I guess, very gendered on a factory then, probably still is today. So I was in a shop of about 25 people.
Right.
The guys would mainly do things like tableware modelling, which is kind of making the blank shapes, which would then be moulded for mass production. And, females would probably specialise more with relief modelling, making the sprigs for the jasperware. But I was quite intrigued to do a bit of both, really. And this is, I think, my curiosity at an early age on the factory. I was kind of fascinated by, I guess, all these divisions of work and, understanding how a factory operated. People kind of separated to become very skilled at what they did at one thing. But me wanting to kind of float around and observe and look at things, even at that early age, to be honest.
So this is the mid-'80s. And
this is 1987.
Yeah. And was Wedgwood a thriving concern at that point?
Yeah. I guess there was probably about 2,000 people at the Barlston site, and generations of families working together, mums, dads, kids, they're on the same factory, it's that kind of intergenerational, let's say, skills passed down. Family connections that get you the work, that's the thing. But I remember the modelers very well because, you weren't taught to do anything. You just watched, observed, and you did, and you failed. and learning through failure was quite important, So the first job I had was to make a sphere in plaster, to turn something in two halves and join the two halves together seamlessly, and then make a cube in plaster, all to be measured very accurately. And I think these were the two tests. So once you'd done them, you kind of okay, So I was fortunately okay to carry on with it. But I look back at those days, and people talk about idea of nostalgia, don't they, and rose-tinted spectacles, but there was a kind of sense of camaraderie and community, and interesting to be immersed in that world at a very early age.
Well, eventually you moved into the company's graphic department, but subsequently you did foundation at your local college. Can you remember making that decision to go back into education? And was there a specific reason?
Yeah, because I trained a year as a modeler and I was offered a job. But I wanted to, like I said, I wanted to amass different experiences. So I'd asked to change it was YTS then, Youth Training Scheme. So I asked to change my placement after the first year, and I went into the design studio, and at that point it was this, again, iconic bit of architecture at the Barlston site, called the Roundhouse. It was where all the design was based historically. Flat roof building, and it looked, circular, and your studios were like a segment of that circle. So kind of interesting architecturally, but also working with a different group of people. And I was trained as a graphic designer then, doing some horrible stuff like commemorative stuff, hideous, horrible, Christmas tree ornaments and bloody souvenir plates for London and stuff like that. But I guess it was the market then, there was a demand for that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But I was encouraged by the people who I worked with, really, to say, because some of them, especially the modellers, had been there and trained as apprentices like me and stayed there. amazingly talented, skilled people, but they felt like they were just stuck, and it was them really who kind of encouraged me to move on and go to college. So I left and did a foundation course at Newcastle-under-Lyme College. And again, quite hard that was, because I'd had all this kind of technical training almost beaten into me. And then you're there chasing butterflies with a net, So
I mean, was that always? Was it always going to be the case that you were going to go to foundation to go to university afterwards? Was that the plan?
To be honest, I didn't have a plan. It just happened. It just, I kind of just trusted my gut, and I looked at the local college and was interested. I'd got this kind of expertise, let's say, from industry, but no space to do anything creative with it. I was basically a kind of fabricator, working from others' ideas or drawings, or working within a very kind of limited marketplace. So it was very tightly governed in terms of creativity. So yeah, I kind of made the leap. I did a year there at Newcastle, and then went to study at Cardiff, and then went on to the Royal College, which I guess was, I loved being in London, immersed in that world. Great 2 years at the Royal College, with a kind of group of interesting people, learning from the students as well as the staff.
Well, you had Felicity Iliff, I think, was in your year, was she not?
Yeah, Liz Ailiff, Nick Reena, Bruno Ruminali.
Okay. Interesting bunch.
Yeah.
I mean, just to go back to Cardiff, presumably when you got there, technically, you must have been really way ahead of your peers.
Yeah, I guess it was a fallback position really for me. But it was that challenge to do something with the skill and to think with the skill. So yeah, it's kind of often a hindrance as well, because you were tied to, this idea of perfection governed by someone else, which is always something I've kind of resisted or reacted against since.
Well, it's a thread in your work that we may well explore down the road. But you were making these kind of figurative pieces that were collaged from casts taken from molds and clay pipes and broken shards of ceramic. I mean, where did that idea come from in the first instance?
Well, when I was at Cardiff, I was very much a hand builder. So, again, using press moulding to assemble a kit of parts into a bigger whole. So it was figurative, it was narrative, it was kind of looking personal politics. But then when I went to the Royal College, it was kind of looking a bit outside and peers, and I guess there's
a lot of sex in there, Neil. I mean, you've missed out the sex. They're quite sexually charged, these pieces.
Yeah.
Does that reflect where you were at the time?
Maybe it does. But I kind of saw the work as really a kind of, I was always really into kind of, kitchen sink dramas, the likes of Ken Loach, Alan Bleasdale I grew up with, watch it, and kind of Mike Leigh, that kind of gritty kind of urban, narrative of, sometimes failure and, but also a kind of a way out. So that I kind of I coined that work really as kind of social documentary, but also me moving away, me coming back to Stoke and seeing friends who were just kind of stuck doing what they did when I'd left, but also that culture of kind of Thursday, Friday night pay packet out on the town and getting hammered and, hedonism, living for today. And
yes. Well, you had a piece called She Wants Your Junk.
Yeah.
Which was about two blokes on the pool. I mean, this isn't subject matter for ceramics generally.
No,
Bernard Leach never touched this kind of subject matter, I don't think, in his oeuvre.
I guess it was just driven by compulsion to, not pass judgment on people, but just to kind of document a certain way of life, something very kind of, I guess it was kind of looking at the dead end and escapism.
It's quite masculine.
Yeah, it was all about masculinity and the flaws of masculinity. But also, these things were constructed from objects. I'd got access to a group of redundant moulds, because when I left the Royal College, I had an exhibition at the Potteries Museum lined up, and I'd contacted a range of different factories to have access to some of these waste moulds. And they'd all agreed, bar Spode, who gave me halves of moulds because I was just going to reproduce stuff. But it was access to a history, an immediate history, without feeling contained to kind of process and making things. These things were kind of ready-mades to dip in and out of and to deconstruct and play around with. So it was really, a gift that they'd agreed to give me these things. I'm not quite sure what they thought when I put them back together for the exhibition.
There's a piece I need to ask you about, which was called "When I Wanted Your Heart, You Didn't Want Mine," which you made in '93.
God, yeah, that's an old Cardiff piece, yeah.
Yeah, and it was shown at the Gladstone Pottery Museum. And according to my research, it had to be placed behind a screen after complaints from the shop staff.
Yeah.
So, I mean, talk me through that. What was that piece? What was that piece about? What did it look like for listeners, and what was it about?
Oh my God, Grant, you're going to put me on the spot here, aren't you? I buried that one.
Well, there you go. I'm here to dig stuff up.
Yeah. Well, I kind of always been, music has been a second point of kind of fascination for me, and a kind of passion. I don't play any music, but I've always been an avid collector and listener to music. The title of that piece comes from a band called Magazine. I don't know whether you know. Howard Devoto. Yeah. And I can't remember which track it's kind of sampled from, but I'd often get the titles for a lot of this work from songs, because they, music's got this kind of, connectivity, hasn't it? You kind of feel something through that lyric or through that kind of piece of music, and it was that immediacy of connection which I was really interested in, and accessibility, really. So these things, the titles are quite blunt or quite direct, or they're kind of ambiguous, some of them. But yeah, that was very much looking at the politics of relationships, and that's all I'm going to say.
Okay. So we're going to let people use their imaginations in that case. But I am quite intrigued, because obviously you went away to Royal College of Art, and then you come back to Stoke, and you make work about your friends. You had one piece called "Don't Let the Little Head Rule the Big Head" in 1996.
Itself, doesn't it?
It does a bit, yeah. But what did they? I mean, A, what did they make of you, and B, what did they make of you turning them into your subject matter, your material, if you like?
Strangely, they were quite flattered, to be honest. Okay. Because it would often be a kind of observation on a night out, or just something. Which was kind of said randomly, which I'd think, oh my God, yeah, it's got a potency or something, which I would then use as the base narrative of some of these pieces. There's kind of symbolism within the pieces as well. So they were quite direct, but they'd operate on numerous levels through some of these factory things which I'd sample. Like you said, the clay pipes. With one of them, it's a beautiful clay pipe, by the way. It got a group of footballers running around it, which was quite poignant. And I used it as the phallus on one of these pieces, And it wasn't, this work wasn't really to, generalize and stuff. They were very kind of, I guess, naive observations at that time, and try and record something quite intimate to me. It wasn't to try and kind of make an overall commentary. It was just something observed very close from those kind of periods of being with those people. But then I I guess I was showing work of that nature at different venues like Crafts Council, and involved in a whole series of shows like Hot Off the Press was one, Decadence was another, Objects of Our Time. There's kind of group of exhibitions in the mid-90s where the work was getting taken up and used, to use as kind of, I guess, themes within the exhibitions, looking at social commentary and stuff. But I got a bit bored because I was making all this stuff. Rarely would it sell. Right. I just got bored of making it, and I was desperate for a kind of flip with the work. And
well, it is interesting, Neil, because you were getting all these critical plaudits for your figurative work towards the end of the 90s, but then you go and take this completely different direction and begin to look at Stoke and the ceramic industry itself. So, I mean, it was boredom is why you changed tack. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, like I say, I was. People want more of the same, don't they? And I to be honest, if I was selling it and maybe benefiting from selling it might have been a different conversation. But I'd very much. It did the rounds, and I was just looking to do something else, and I'd applied for a residency at the European Ceramic Works Centre in 1998 and got a place for 1999, which at that point in time the EKWC was this magnet for people who were interested in working in clay but not necessarily from a ceramic background.
Right.
So you get a mix of architects, painters, textile artists exploring what clay can do. And the thing what really attracted me was that you don't have to come out with anything at the end, out with anything at the end of the residency period. And I thought, well, that really is interesting for me. It's just about returning to that basis of curiosity to drive forward ideas and the work. And I went there just to really escape narrative, the stranglehold of storytelling. And I think I stayed there a month and then came home for a week. And just by chance, I've forgotten all about this actually. I went to visit one of these guys who's represented in a lot of these figurative pieces. I went to visit him on site because he'd left Wedgwood. And he was working in a demolition company, and he was knocking down this factory. I think it was in Tunstall. I just went to see him on site, and it clicked really about these places which were once prevalent up and down the city. I'd seen tabloid press about globalisation hitting and work going elsewhere. But to see the physical dismantling of something, it was really poignant, So I'd during that week when I was back home, I just went round to various sites and just started photographing stuff. And I think subconsciously it filtered back into what I was doing then in Holland. And my brief when I applied to the EKWC was very loose. It was just about exploring the materiality of clay and interaction of tools, or something as vague as that. It could have been anything. Me wanting to escape narrative, it starts to trickle in a bit more deeper, but in a different way. I was working. One, I'd got a huge studio space, so that was going to obviously influence the nature of the work. Instead of working out of a back bedroom in the house. Yeah. I'd got facilities like a hose pipe and stuff, and I can remember modelling things with very wet clay and shaping them with the erosive action of water, So there was something about, I guess it boils down to me not having any physical contact with the material, but letting the tools direct the nature of whatever came out, So using a builder's trowel or a shovel, for instance, to shape the pieces, or using random moulds to kind of form parts, which then would be disintegrated through water again. So it was a really playful, unfettered period of time where I didn't really worry about anything. It was changing. It's kind of life changing. And again, some really kind of high profile people there working alongside me. Richard Meitner, the glassmaker, a couple of painters, Dutch painters. Walter McConnell from Alfred was there. So yeah, it was a really important time. And just being kind of stripped out of your comfort zone and planted somewhere else, and just being left to have access to a studio 24/7. Because me and my obsessive nature with stuff, I just kind of would be working late and then getting up and then working again. And, I was kind of living the work, really. So I must have made, in 3 months, I must have made about 2 years worth of work, which was amazing. But didn't have any inkling of where to show it, because most objects, I guess craft-centred galleries were looking at things on plinths and stuff.
Well, I was going to ask, because there seems to be a show that the Crafts Council did called Close in 2000. Yeah. That seems potentially quite pivotal. What did you show at that?
Well, that was interesting because I think word had got around that I'd done the residency at the EKWC, and I had, testing me now, Louise, who was director.
Taylor, Louise Taylor, I think Louise, yeah.
Yeah, it was Louise Taylor. She came up to Stoke, and she, I was kind of not really expecting anything, but they'd started to curate these 3-person shows, and there was one which just so happened to be focused upon social context, which I guess the work fitted in really well. And again, just the nature of the work being something else appealed at that point in time. So that was in 2000. So quite early on to have to be part of a 3-person show at the Crafts Council then, and it's still being kind of not fully formed and still, a bit.
So
like
what did you show then, Neil? What did people see? Was it like Dylan going electric? Were people shocked at the lack of sexually charged?
Maybe they
figures?
were. Maybe they were. Maybe they were expecting something else. But I guess they were deconstructions. They weren't. They were kind of looking at space, and like I say, the fragment has always been something of interest. I've always been, as a kid, been interested in history and archaeology. So that's something. I always say my practice is an hybrid practice. It encompasses a range of different things. But me making the shards was interesting, something about kind of taking away from the whole. And, they kind of invite curiosity, it goes back to this thing I spoke about earlier, the presence of absence again. Mm. So I had this quite large tableau at the Crafts Council, which was probably about, was it like 3 meters by 1.5 meters, to show some of these assemblages, spatial assemblages. I got some very small works which were, what was interesting, and I'd spend like time with process, and then at a point, the discard from making, which I'd usually recycle, I was using that to make things with, so that, the kind of remnants from a mould or the scraps which I'd scrape off a table, I would be assembling these very kind of intuitively, assembling these things together. So there were kind of a range of different scales, but also, reflectively kind of piecing back together observations. And I had people saying, they could read things like bottle ovens in there, and I couldn't. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I was just intrigued by this the shard, really, because when I was back home, I'd photographed the archaeology section at PMAG at the Potteries Museum, and I've always loved it. I always go back to it, and it's basically a case of shelves of these randomly juxtaposed fragments, which have probably just been dug out of the same hole, but they've got a presence, a kind of, the kind of bit of a handle next to a pot lid, next to a piece of kiln furniture, and they were systematic, but also kind of disordered, which, this thing of contradiction again in the work. So I kind of borrowed from that kind of taxonomy of the museum to start to work with the shards as well.
Yeah, because it's also around now that you started working in different media as part of your PhD. You filmed 80 hours of people working at the Wedgwood factory. The results were shown at the Potteries Museum and Art Gallery 2005. I'm interested, what does your old model making department look like when you returned? Had it changed much in the intervening years?
Because I guess when I went to Holland, that was the start of doing the PhD. So it was kind of an open question as well. And then when I went back to Wedgwood, it was the final phase of the PhD, and I was looking at kind of documenting craft skills from production which were, I guess, endangered or not being carried on through, the increasing use of technology on the factory. So a lot of this knowledge was becoming redundant, I mean, technology was amazing. It was kind of reducing lead time in terms of development. But at the tail end of it, you'd got kind of people-based knowledge, which was being kind of sacrificed because of that. And I'd contacted the factory, and I was amazed again that they let me on the factory, to be honest, because it was at a point, 2003, where they were just starting to dismantle Barlaston, and
right.
I'd turn up there and the car park was full of pieces of equipment and which are being shipped off elsewhere for production. And I'd walk round places which were kind of buoyant, and there'd be like a couple of people rattling around in a space, and then at the other end of the factory there'd be this robot, which was so yeah, huge change. But you kind of started to feel that the soul had been ripped out of the place. And so I went there to really kind of document this knowledge as an insider, not to have like a fancy bit of kind of film work, but also come from my knowledge to go back into that environment, but to ask them questions as though I was an outsider. But it's that kind of duality, insider outsider, which was interesting.
Which you kind of were, weren't you? I mean, you've been on the inside, but you've been away and come back, which is intriguing. Yeah,
so I kind of rock up, and a lot of friends were still there, and that's what gave me access to places and parts of the factory which people probably wouldn't have had access to. So yeah, it was a kind of fascinating deep dive into that world again. And when I started, I filmed the last 2 weeks of someone who trained me as an apprentice because they were getting made redundant. So I had the privilege of recording his last couple of weeks of work. And it's, really touching to kind of play the film back. He was modelling a reproduction piece of creamware, and he'd resisted going the digital. He was, he'd seen making as a sensual act, and he wasn't bothered about pushing buttons, and hence he didn't survive. But it was kind of really nice to shadow him. So I just filmed the hands making things and the materials. Because, you speak to anyone on the factory and they've got this amazing, breadth of knowledge, which they're very modest about, material knowledge and kind of touch knowledge. And, it's just a job to them, 8 till 5, and then they go home. There's nothing kind of fancy about it. And I think that's what really made things more poignant. It was trying to give those people a platform to celebrate that knowledge, which was completely overlooked, to be honest.
Which has been a key thread, in your work subsequently, hasn't it?
Yeah. I mean, I've always, it's at a point where I was making work about skill, and I kind of thought, well, really, it should be about the people doing the skill and me just, someone called me I can't remember who it was, a post-industrial factory manager, but I guess it's just bringing these people together in a space to re-navigate that skill, I guess, politically, and just to put it back into a cultural setting, the opportunity to work with people. And it's an ongoing process because, it's not just something which is surface, you do something and then leave. Whenever I've got the funding, I'll go back to these people and ask them if they're keen to do something. No pressure. And they've always pretty much said yes. They've always kind of wanted to do it because I think they get what I'm trying to say with the work, to be honest.
Yeah. I mean, you've done numerous projects over the years, such as the Salvage series. There was an 8-year research project entitled Typographics of the Obsolete, which ran from 2012 to 2020, which looked at production as a raw material. There was National Treasure, which was about factory tourism. What is factory tourism? Can we explain what that term means?
I guess it's factories have tried to capitalise as much as they can on kind of generating income, and I think that goes back to that period at Wedgwood, because they were just starting to put together this factory tour. And there was a lot of kind of reaction against it because it was almost like bringing people from different departments, centralising them in a space. And I could get what they're saying. It's a bit like kind of monkeys in a cage, that kind of thing.
I mean, I have done the Wedgwood factory tour on a couple of occasions, and it did feel a slightly curious experience watching people, because it's working. It's it's quite intimate thing that you're doing, but they almost made to perform. It's a curious sensation.
It's a weird one for me, because I knowing these people and where they'd worked prior to that, there was, of course, with any work there's banter and there's that, but they get the work done. But when you're on display, you kind of cut that fun bit out of the work, don't you? And it's always like you're on show. And I find it problematic, to be honest. It's a bit kind of, so it kind of touched a nerve at that point, just being there and seeing and hearing these people talk about being put on show. And I guess it kind of dictated this piece for Topographies of the Obsolete, which was called National Treasure. But I was looking at the flip side. I was working with the redundant Spode factory then. This was in 2013, I think. So there was whole kind of areas of Spode which had just been closed off, and with the project funding, we opened them back up again. And there was one area which just seemed perfect because it was kind of like boarded off, but there was kind of glass windows in it. And I just situated 3 hand painters behind the glass, at kind of different intervals during the biennial, to paint these scenes of kind of, I guess, demolition of Stoke, kind of post-industrial decay, but very much inspired by this, groups of work from the 18th century, looking at the romantic ruin, the kind of Pompeii, Herculaneum were being excavated. You'll see a whole range of this kind of, the Gothic kind of architecture, or the kind of Roman ruin on a plate, Wedgwood's neoclassicism. So that was kind of interesting to play around with that as a concept. But the work was basically them working within those spaces. And again, there was this kind of voyeurism, this thing about, the thing about watching anyone making something is that it draws you in, it sucks you in, doesn't it? And the language of making needs no words. But then this being separated by glass as they kind of applied the skills, you kind of, there's a confrontation there. It's like you shouldn't be looking, but you want to look. And I was kind of interested in that dichotomy, really. not being able to engage in a conversation because the glass is there, but you're just an observer looking in. And behind them performing was the derelict factory. It was kind of this thing of, contrast again. And the plates, they were painted on the backs of plates which I'd found at Spode, which, I found them all covered in pigeon shit, cleaned them off. And then, they paint on the back where the foot ring is, because the foot of the plate is something, historically where a painter would mark, their signature. It's a kind of mark of pride, really. So just by working on the back and the foots of these plates, then painting these scenes of kind of, I guess kind of post-industrial kind of decay across the 6 towns, it seemed to, it seemed to kind of work as a piece of work. But then it went to South Korea as a piece of work, and it kind of, it was entered for a prize in South Korea, and it kind of won the main prize. And I had the opportunity to take one of the painters with me to do this performance. But what was interesting about South Korea was the system of UNESCO's convention from 2003 to safeguard intangible cultural inheritance.
Yes. Which we have just signed up to.
We signed up to it last year in June, didn't we? Thank God. I've been a kind of passionate advocate for it since then, since the early, 2013. But just to perform this piece of work in that space in Korea where I guess, people with high artistic capabilities are respected and their knowledge is safeguarded and preserved for the future was interesting. There's a film of Spode played behind.
Because he juxtaposed, I'm right in thinking he juxtaposed these South Korean artists with the artisans from the Spode factory. This was the point of the project.
That was in another project, which was another called Factory.
Yes.
So this was my first introduction to Korea.
Yeah, okay.
So we went over in 2015 and we did this performance of National Treasure. And the image what I used for the painting was of, I think it was from BBC News, and it was of a Indonesian worker painting a Wedgwood plate in Indonesia. And it was kind of intriguing as an image. And I got the painter I took from Stoke to paint that image on the back of one of these pieces of ware which I'd found at the Spode factory. And it was just about this kind of cycle of globalisation, wherever things are being made cheaper, this is where things will go, at the detriment of people who've invested, I guess, most of their working lives in these factories and who are, it's parts of communities are decimated in terms of working together, that kind of, the heart had been ripped out of place and people, people couldn't do what they loved anymore. But to put them on that cultural platform and to share that knowledge and have this kind of political conversation was kind of interesting for that piece of work. But part of the prize for 2017 was to have a solo exhibition at Icheon, World Ceramics Centre. And this is where I was kind of interested in that idea of collective labour, but also about hierarchy of knowledge. Because, the skills of a mould maker here or master mould maker, or the skills of people like Rita Floyd, who's a kind of China
who's
flower
your flower maker. Yeah.
Massively overlooked or kind of situated in spaces where it is about nostalgia and it is about kind of looking back to the past. It's a working museum kind of, nostalgia trip. And I've always believed that these skills are not redundant. It's the thinking behind the skills which are redundant. But, you reactivate this knowledge and it can be something else,
So it's not about preservation for you, Neil. This is quite key.
Not at all. It's not about freezing something in the past. It's about I guess it's taking that history and that knowledge and looking towards the future with it. It's never been, this is the kind of misunderstanding. It's always been about, it's that thing of, the unrealized potential of the past, which I'm interested in, and kind of use of history, recycling of histories, but finding new ways to kind of look at these things. So I took James and Rita to Korea for this project, but also had an opportunity to work with some of these living national treasures in Korea. And by situating them both in the same space, working together, the bodily intelligences were the same.
Yeah.
It's just, culturally, hierarchies are just, culturally planted upon these people, these kind of people in Korea, revered and looked up at. And then, James was working as a builder at that point. He was out of the ceramic industry, but this is the thing about that skill and that knowledge, it doesn't go away. And he was a bit worried about coming to Korea with me because he hadn't done it before, but you just know it's going to be okay because I think it's that kind of muscle memory and bodily, knowing about materials, dipping your hand in the plaster, but you never forget, do you?
So you've got all this skill that remains just about in Stoke. I mean, how do you go about reviving the city in that case? I know there are companies like 1882 who are doing, really interesting work. Is that the future, a kind of smaller, high-skilled workforce?
I think what's been, the downfall for this place is, apart from people cashing in and shipping work outside, outsourcing, and I think that the detriment was that they never looked forward. They always thought they could make the same thing forever.
Yeah.
And wouldn't really take any risks with industry. And I think, that was the downfall for a lot of places. The tooling up costs to make something new are kind of astronomical with big industry. But the nice thing is now is you've got, companies like Emily's Factory 1882 who've got that flexibility and adaptability, who want to take risks and challenge the idea of what an industrial product is, and think differently with that knowledge base. So it's still about keeping that skill alive, but what they're doing is doing something very different with it, and I think that I kind of have massive respect for that. So the bottom line is, you look at places like Korea and China, which embrace the high tech with the tradition. It's important to keep both. And I think that's something we've, again, massively overlooked. We've always relied on technology or engineering to cut the corners, but I think we're missing a trick here. Because when you think of places like Stoke-on-Trent, which have been, the foundation of people who've worked in factories, and it's the identity of the place, isn't it? The people. And I think you've got to kind of... there's got to be a balance ethically with kind of outsourcing stuff and keeping things in the city, and people over profit over people. Which it has been, and I think it's really tricky territory to navigate. And I don't know what the answers are, without getting all jingoistic, which I won't do. I think there's got to be a place for cultural value. Economic value comes later, I guess, doesn't it? If you get that kind of right with, looking at systems to safeguard, not preserve, safeguard to pass on for the future. And I do believe there's kids who are, at school are not so kind of academically orientated, who'd love to do some of these things, kind of modelling. Things like what I did, model making, that kind of immersion into a skill and, the tool at hand and the body in the space. It's kind of I do believe there's scope there, but there isn't an opportunity with a lot of factories because they can't afford kind of an apprenticeship to take on people. And I've been around a lot of kind of modern factories, and it's kind of they're my age, 55 plus. You kind of spot anyone who's a bit younger. It's really hard. So it's getting over that kind of perception that, one, it's a failed industry, and how do you bring people younger generation back into that industry? Because there is that irony now. There's a skill shortage. And there's people who turn up and maybe do a year at some of these places, and then bugger off and do something else. So it's really it's a kind of dilemma. But I'm kind of passionate of finding a way to keep things. You're not going to keep everything, but to keep the core of some things which have got value for the future, I think is really important.
There's no question that you're amplifying the skills of people like Rita Floyd and the other industrial crafts that Stoke was built on. I mean, the other thing that comes out in your work, there are a number of themes that converge, but you're very interested in imperfection and flaws. I mean, is this to do with, I don't know, the furniture maker and author David Pye and his workmanship of risk and workmanship of certainty? Is this where this comes from, or this is your industrial background at Wedgwood?
I know David Pye's work, and it is interesting conceptually, but it comes very much from that immersion of being told what to do and explicit knowledge. This is how you do it. You don't veer off the mark, and you start from here, and you do all this and this to get to that point. There's no divergence. Whereas my work now is about the middle space. It's about the kind of something which hasn't become something yet. It's kind of that's why I use film, because it captures the ephemeral nature of materials. So I've got a knowledge of ceramics and industry, but I've always looked at other materials to try and frame that knowledge in a way and bring a fresh perspective. I still see it as ceramic, even though it's made out of textile.
I mean, it always seems to me you've chosen a really hard route. I mean, being a ceramicist is not a guarantee of riches by any stretch of your imagination. But I mean, as you've said, you don't really get your work sold in galleries. I mean, Collect, the high-end craft fair, is coming up, but you won't have pieces there, for instance.
I've never had a commercial outlet for the work.
Yeah.
I was with Anita Besson up until she retired in, I think, 2010. And Anita was great. She, I know she thought that the work was kind of pretty non-commercial, but she showed it because she liked it. I kind of always respected her for that. And since then, I've never really embraced the kind of gallery market, and these performances, they're not about the outcome. They're about the process and about the work in itself. The kind of remnants of things can often be the record of that performance and be kind of reworked. But I guess with me being in education, I'm salaried.
Well, I was going to ask about the importance of education to what you do, and how, presumably it's allowed you to follow this particular route.
It has, yes. I guess it's given me the luxury of just kind of trusting the work as a research process, and it's open-ended, and it's kind of more questions can be asked from the work, and it's never finite, and it's so that's what keeps me interested, is that this thing's fluid, it's shifting, and what I thought at one point in time might change in 2 years' time. It's never fixed, it's kind of open, and I guess people want to be told what it is, and so they can live with it and all that stuff, don't they? I'm kind of
get dusting instructions and all that.
Can sit on this, I mean, that's why this room is a kind of graveyard in the back. If you look on Google Earth where I live, you'll see like 3 or 4 tarpaulins, and it's like a graveyard of work.
I do research, but that would be properly stalking. I'm not sure that's right. Yeah. Neil, we are kind of out of time, I have to say, which is a shame because I've thoroughly enjoyed myself. But I mean, inevitable last question. The Farnham show runs till what, the 8th of February. Yeah. What is next for you after that?
I've kind of working. I was kind of fortunate to be given a honorary professorship from Jingzhen Ceramic University.
Very nice.
And it doesn't come with any financial remuneration. So,
but do you get one of those mortarboards and more gowns and stuff?
Well, not yet.
Not yet.
I've got a badge. But
okay. It makes it sound like Blue Peter. Anyway,
but yeah, I think they, the rationale for giving it me was for looking at kind of safeguarding cultural inheritance, which they're big on. In fact, I think Jingzhen were given the equivalent of so many billion. I think it was 14 billion Chinese yen to protect and safeguard their kind of cultural inheritance. And
interesting,
it'd be great, wouldn't it, for here?
Interesting, yeah.
So they kind of reckon, and parallel histories. Part of this exhibition at Craft Study Centre looks at cultural borrowing. There wouldn't be Stoke-on-Trent if we hadn't robbed everything from the Chinese.
This is
and that's part of the thing of, part of the exhibition was trying to, I guess, get people looking at the importance of cultural influence. Tea drinking, the teapot. We hadn't got it before, But then this thing of borrowing and adapting ideas, and the idea of bone china being this kind of emulation of porcelain, and you can go on, and cultural borrowing of symbolism and the exotic, and this is what this project kind of touches upon, and the problematics of looking at that today, when really in reality, I guess a lot of factories were just like ripping each other off, trying to money, so all the things what we look at as problematic today, historically, I guess it was survival.
So China for you in that case?
Yeah, China. We're working on a collaboration. I kind of veered off the mark again. Yeah, working on a collaboration with them, which I'm quite excited about, really. But it is looking at the willow pattern as this piece of chinoiserie, which has been murdered. It's done to death. It's a kind of bit of a cliche, but that's what I like about it. But it's looking at it from the lens of a Chinese perspective, and how it was used historically and politically, in the 1800s, and this navigation of, the willow pattern story, which is a British fabrication to sell more pots. The willow pattern is a British invention, sampled from all these Chinese prototypes. So me interrogating that history from a different lens and working with a Chinese colleague who kind of can tell his history a bit better than what I can, it's interesting. And working with someone who's a historian, I'm forever kind of learning things, and that's what keeps me going.
Very good. Very good. Yeah. We have to wrap it up then, Neil, but that was a lovely hour and a bit of my life. Thank you so much. Love to see you again. I really enjoyed myself.
Yeah, right. I'll put the lights back on now.